So just to kick off with introductions, I'm Alice. I work for Seahorse Environmental, an environmentally focused policy comms and strategy agency, and I have the pleasure of working closely with the Nattergal team. So really pleased to be involved in today's conversation. I'll pass over to Ivan.
Thanks, Alice. Hi, everybody. I'm Ivan de Klee, and I work for Nattergal as the head of natural capital. Very briefly, Nattergal is a nature restoration company. We are trying to deliver biodiversity uplift on a landscape scale across some really quite amazing projects and amazing landscapes. And so in the context of this call, we're really on the project developer side of things. We're creating the carbon and sequestering it in our systems and hoping to take that to the market.
Thanks, Ivan. And Amy?
Thanks. Great to be on the call today. I'm Amy Carroll. I'm an economist and associate director working at Arup, and I was involved with the project, working with Ivan and the team. So here to present a bit today. Thank you.
Finally, Danielle.
Great to be here, and thanks for having me. I'm Danielle Mulder, and I lead sustainability at the BBC.
Great, thank you very much. So just to run through what we're doing today, so we're going to run through the problem that we're facing, the solutions, and kind of bring in the business angle towards the end. So just to kick off with Ivan, I think lots of people on the call here will know about NEP and its success as one of the great examples of nature restoration in the UK, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later and how it features in the report as a really good guidance and illustration of what everyone can be doing. But really interested to hear from you about the problem that we're facing.
Thanks so much, Alice. Yeah, I think it's just important at this point to say that whilst we've done this amazing project that Amy will present on, and we're trying to break down barriers, as are the BBC, there are a few barriers in the way. But what we wanted this webinar to be about really is about solutions to those barriers. So the first couple of slides, whilst I'll be talking about the problem, it's not insurmountable. And later on, we'll come back to these barriers and think through actually how we're going to get over them on the site level, really. So to start things off, as you all know, or many of you, 90% of you, I'm sure, will know about the funding gap. Over the next decade, according to the GFI, there's a £56 billion funding gap between the nature commitments we've made as a country and what we're currently spending. And whilst BNG, which does feature as a kind of a strong part of Nattergal's business model, is great, and it's coming, it's limited to England, and it's not going to plug that gap in its entirety. And that is where we need businesses like the BBC, businesses like Arup, to invest in biodiversity to help try and plug this massive gap between the ecological catastrophe, frankly, that we're in and where we need to get to. And so this webinar really is about finding mechanisms to enable those businesses to invest in what I'm describing as biodiversity-rich projects. These are biodiversity-led projects that go beyond woodland carbon code, tree planting, that go beyond the standard into leading with nature and how we can find the right mechanisms, find the right prices to make these happen. So on the next slide, I'll talk about what's holding us back. And that is, I've highlighted 8 things here. There are many more, but these are what I see as the barriers from a project developer perspective on how we find the right buyers at the right price for our carbon that we're sequestering through rewilding or biodiversity projects. One is around data gaps. So there's tons and tons of data around woodland creation and tree planting, because people have been doing it for a long time, and it's relatively easy to measure because it's often trees in lines, and you know what you're planting and you know what you're going to get. Whereas in biodiversity rich or biodiversity led projects like a rewilding project or a grassland or a completely mosaic ecosystem, the data hasn't always been there, particularly for soils. And so when Amy presents on our report, that is one of the solutions we've come up with is plugging that data gap for a couple of lowland English habitats. Verification and certification is a crucial element for buyers to feel comfortable that their units are high integrity that they're buying. They need to be verified and certified. And at the moment, those verification certification schemes are largely restricted, again, to woodland creation and peatland as well. And so how do we get verification and certification for other habitats, crucially, that deliver massive amounts of biodiversity? And so peatland has its own little category here. We won't talk about much peat in this webinar, but at the moment it's considered an avoided loss by SPTI, which means that some buyers aren't able to use it as part of their target setting. Now, peatland restoration can be extraordinary for biodiversity, and it's an amazing, amazing climate solution. But that is a kind of a niche point that we won't come back to today, but happy to talk to you about it at another time. And then how do we define biodiversity rich, and how do we define high integrity? And how do we measure that so that the buyer who is looking at investing in these biodiversity rich carbon projects, they know that they are really getting biodiversity, and it's not just another planting project in the uplands that hasn't been well thought through or delivered in hand with the community. So trying to find something to tell that biodiversity story and to move beyond what I see at the moment is an overuse of the word high integrity. Just because your project has been verified and certified by a code doesn't mean you've worked with your communities, doesn't mean that you're thinking about nature first and carbon as a secondary outcome. And so trying to tease out what high integrity really means and how people are using it across the market before it in turn becomes a greenwash term itself. And that's something I think we all need to be aware of. I'll quickly comment on above and below biomass and carbon. At the moment, the standards and the verification schemes split carbon into everything that's above ground, so trees and woodlands, and everything that's below ground, i.e. soils and peat. The verification schemes at the moment are struggling to combine those two carbon pools. And in a rewilding project or in a biodiversity recovery project, there's so much going on in the soils as they recover from intensive land use, and there's so much going on above ground in the trees, and those two pools together represent a huge amount of carbon sequestration. But until we can combine them and accredit them, then that's going to limit the amount you can sell them for. And then price is a challenge at the moment for what I would describe as high integrity, so community engagement, long-term, in perpetuity, nature first, all of these elements. Well, it costs a lot of money to deliver that, particularly in where land prices are expensive, i.e. lowland England and other parts of Britain. And so getting the right price that values all of that community work and that local focus is crucial. And that, Amy will touch on the markets and Danielle will come to it in the end. And that's going to be the point where the leading corporates invest and pay what it's worth, and then the project developers like us will be able to move forward with our projects. So they're the barriers. We will come back to them. And so I'll let Amy introduce our report, which was really trying to plug a couple of those issues.
Thanks, Ivan. So yeah, we got involved with the project initially in terms of the funding. So we applied through the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, through DEFRA and the Environment Agency, and were successful in round 2. And it was a fantastic opportunity. It brought together a collaboration that otherwise wouldn't have happened. And it brought together private landowner in Knepp Estate, and obviously a pioneer in rewilding, a natural capital company in Nattergal, Arup as a sustainable development consultancy. We offer multidisciplinary services, including environmental economics and wider environmental services. Academia in Queen Mary University of London, who provided fieldwork and research and monitoring of natural vegetation regeneration and the related carbon storage. And closely linked to this, we had technology-based carbon measurement companies in tree economy and agri-carbon, bringing really innovative solutions. So, I mean, in terms of from a personal point of view, it's kind of one of the most enjoyable projects I've worked on in terms of that collaboration and working across different sectors of the market. And sort of that truly sort of problem solving. I think we all felt like we were, working together to solve a problem and challenges and working towards making a positive difference. So from that perspective, like a really fantastic project, and hopefully some of the partners are on the call today as well. So like Ivan said, there were some problems that we set out to address. So the project had 3 main objectives. The first, to plug data gaps in terms of carbon sequestration and storage potential of rewilding. And so what better place to do that than to use NEP, essentially like the ideal testing ground, given you've got 20+ years of natural regeneration, a lot of evidence around the biodiversity gain that's been achieved, absolutely amazing success in terms of NEP estates transformation, but less evidence on the kind of carbon side. So this project really looked to use the NEP estate in the southern block of NEP and compare that against the previous landscape of the arable farming to see what that uplift in above and below ground carbon had been over time. And really that would then, hopefully, we hoped would set the case for investment in these types of projects, showing what could be achieved. And then secondly, to use that data of the above and below ground carbon uplift to then understand the potential for generating certified carbon credits from rewilded habitats. And this involved us working, like I said, with partners to understand kind of the cost effectiveness and practicalities of applying technologies to then monitor, report the carbon and measure the carbon, and how you could potentially take that to market through different routes to market. And so the third objective was to kind of actually think about how this would work in practice. So very well sort of testing NEP and getting the data, but then thinking about actually at Nattergal, with Nattergal, thinking about their sites, and the one that we looked at was Boothby Lodge Farm, how you could actually take the learnings and then apply that, and whether it actually works in practice and whether there's a viable route there to market. So here's there's some images here from our report. In terms of NEP, it provided the data and the evidence, like I said, the 20 years of process-led natural regeneration to study. So the image on the left, that is from Tree Economy, who surveyed NEP's southern block using drones, LiDAR, and photogrammetry to build a 3D model of the landscape, and then had to plug a data gap in terms of the equations required to take that 3D model and turn that into estimates, essentially, of like volume of biomass above the ground, which could then, from that, you can then estimate the carbon. So that was kind of their piece of work, and linked to that on the right-hand side, some images there of drones. So Queen Mary University London studied different methodologies for gathering that volumetric data, comparing sort of lower cost commercial drones, which are shown in the image, with highly specialized research grade drones to look at the kind of cost effectiveness of applying these technologies for landowners. And they also looked at the whether it would be feasible to use publicly available LiDAR data sets from the Environment Agency. So kind of exploring different options for using technology, for landowners to use technology to both baseline and monitor those changes in natural vegetation over time. And some of those findings were really interesting, and can maybe come on to them a bit later. And then the middle image there is of AgriCarbon, who undertook over 1,000 core samples across the NEP estate, and also on adjoining arable farms as the control. And then they were able to analyse the below ground, the soil carbon sequestration on the site. And that image there, I think, is of one of their 1 metre cores. And I wish I'd been on site, Ivan, to see all that happen, because it looked really good. And yeah, watching them go out doing all that sampling.
Trying to drive one of those through a 20-year-old scrubland is no mean feat. So those guys were doing quite an amazing job.
So yeah, bringing all that technology together, we were able to provide estimates of the carbon that had been captured above and below ground at NEP, which Ivan's going to run through.
Thanks so much, Amy. Yeah, and I guess the headline figures here is that it was completely extraordinary what we discovered, and what the teams, the scientific teams, Queen Mary, Tree Economy, and AgriCarbon basically unpacked. And over the last 20 years at NEP, and for anyone who doesn't know the story of NEP, in 20 seconds, it was an arable farm in 2000. And then over a period of 10 years, they departed arable farming and reintroduced free-roaming herbivores and allowed natural colonization of trees to colonize that 1,000 acres. And in the last 20 years, the most extraordinary biodiversity uplift has taken place. And as Amy said, this was about trying to plug the carbon story to complement all of that biodiversity uplift. And what we discovered really is that combined, the scrub and tree regeneration together with the soil carbon has sequestered around 5.2 tons of carbon per hectare per year, CO2 equivalent. And to give you some context of that, that was over a 19-year period. To give you some context as to what that means, it's around 86% of the level of a new woodland if you put it through the Woodland Carbon Code over the same time period. So for us, this was just a huge moment because, as I said at the beginning, the carbon money at the moment is flowing towards woodland, and not that we want that to stop at all, but we do need some of that to head towards these biodiversity-rich nature-first projects. And so there is a ton more research going on at the moment, and including a PhD by Nancy Burrell, who's part of the Burrell family and studying at Oxford. And she's published her first chapter of that PhD, indicating that there's, in the roots below ground, in the scrub and trees that are regenerated, there's a load of additional carbon, almost like an iceberg, where it's as much above ground as there is below ground, meaning that actually, if you include those figures, it's more than a woodland creation project. Now, just to caveat that sentence, in those woodland figures from the Woodland Carbon Code, they don't really include soils, which is a problem highlighted on that first slide at the moment. Everyone loves to split the soils away from the woodland, but we're talking about whole ecosystems here. And so this data gap is a really, really exciting one to have filled. And the soil carbon paper will be published, peer-reviewed later this year. And the work that Queen Mary are doing hopefully going through publication later on as well. Just a quick image of that photo is what you have is 3 small cores of soil. And on the left-hand side is from a ploughed arable field. In the middle is from a grass margin as you enter the NEP wildland area. And then the furthest right is under the scrubland. And you can see, if anyone knows soil, of which many of you will do, the crumblier it is, the healthier it is, the blacker it is, the more carbon there is. And you can see on the far left there, a blocky, pale clay, basically a dysfunctional low carbon soil, transitioning from left to right. And I love this image because it's really what's happened underground over the last 20 years at NEP as the soils have recovered. And in doing so, sequestered around 4 tons of CO2 equivalent per hectare per year in the soils. Next slide, please, Alice. I think, so I think Amy will now kind of briefly outline the market, and then I'll try and briefly outline problems to the solution, answers to the issues. But we need to make sure we've got enough time for Danielle to then talk about the role of business. So I won't take too long on my bit.
Yeah, I was about to say exactly the same thing. I'm sure everyone wants to hear from Danielle, so I'll probably skim through this bit quite quickly. But essentially the report, as well as, looking at the research, also provided analysis of the market and considered the existing routes to market, as well as perhaps how the market's emerging or evolving further. So the aim is obviously to create an investable and commercially viable nature restoration projects through generating certified high quality biodiversity-led carbon credits. So we explored routes including Woodland Carbon Code, Wilder Carbon and Vera, through a relatively new methodology that they've got, the afforestation, reforestation and revegetation ARR methodology. We set out kind of the pros and cons of each, and we also set that in the context of sort of what's happening in the market structure, some of the complexity in the market and some of the need for greater transparency and trust, particularly in the light of recent sort of voluntary carbon market scrutiny around what essentially we're paying for and are we investing in the right things. A bit around carbon price and the price that's needed to incentivize these types of projects and make them commercially viable, and also policy that can support this in terms of UK policy, particularly allowing these projects to stack up essentially. But there remain key barriers, and I think that's that we need to find solutions for, and I think that's what Ivan, you're going to briefly touch on now before handing to Danielle.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, I guess this for me is the exciting bit, is we worked for 2 years on that report and all that amazing data, and then wrote, you know, and this report will be made available after the webinar, by the way, it's publicly available. We wrote the section on the markets, and there's a danger with something like that, then it just stops. But fortunately with Nattergal, we have a net style project up in Lincolnshire called Boothby Wildland, and we needed to and need to demonstrate natural capital financing for this site. So we're exploring all sorts of interesting mechanisms, including BNG and voluntary biodiversity credits, and crucially to this conversation, carbon and biodiversity rich carbon at that. And so just referring to some of those barriers, the data gap, well, I would argue we've plugged for this type of ecosystem to a degree with the NEP report. And so the numbers in that NEP report drastically improve the volumes of carbon we'll be able to sell. So that's one barrier partly solved. However, there are tons and tons of other projects out there at the moment, rewilding projects, biodiversity-led projects, where amazing MRV, basically monitoring and science is underway. And so that will just build the scientific literature to support the figures behind what we expect will happen at Boothby. Verification and certification. Now, there are beginning to be schemes that will help us access the market, two of which Amy just referenced. One is Rewilding Carbon, who we're working with at Boothby. They, at the moment, aren't including soil carbon in their models, but that will come as the soil carbon papers are published. And so is largely still restricted to woodlands, but they are pioneering, really pushing at the very edge of incorporating other habitats into their standard, which is really, really exciting. There's also Vera, which is a global standard, better known for being in the news associated with the REDD+ avoided loss projects. They have a new standard called ARR, Afforestation, Regeneration and Reforestation, Revegetation. And they do combine soil carbon and woody biomass. And whilst there aren't any projects in the UK at the moment because of that cost of verification, we're looking at becoming an aggregator to help other projects and all of us come to get access to this carbon market. Again, I'll briefly touch on measurable biodiversity benefit. In England, we're fortunate because we have the habitat metric that's used in the BNG market, so we can use that to calculate the amount of habitat units we'll generate, whilst also looking at the tons of CO2 we're sequestering. But we're also looking at nature tech and other MRV solutions and other credit methodologies, all of which I hope will prove to the buyer of the important biodiversity benefits of this type of carbon sequestration. And so price really is the final one, and the price isn't there yet. And so for a lot of projects, we're going to have to wait and push and wait for the corporates and the businesses to come to the table to pay what carbon is really worth in a community and biodiversity-led project. Now, we are having some really exciting conversations about sales of carbon at what I would argue is a proper price. And I'll pass over to Danielle to talk about how businesses are thinking about this. And obviously Danielle and the BBC are leading the way, but I think it's an important place to pass over, because finding that price, finding the true value of nature-rich carbon is the crucial thing which will change the market here.
Thanks, Ivan. Danielle, just to jump in before we move on, just skipping back to one of the previous slides, just had a question in about what the acronym for MRV is, if one of you can explain that.
Yes, I've forgotten the R, but the first is monitoring and the last is verification.
Measurement, reporting and verification.
Well, thank you.
Is the language used for the system that's required, basically. for nature. So thanks very much. And what's brilliant about this is the scientific rigor that we can see that sits behind this. It's absolutely critical, particularly for an organisation like the BBC, to have that rigor and that assurance that there's a high quality approach being deployed here. Because we can't just claim, that we're going to take a position on nature positive. It needs to be backed up by scientific rigor. It needs to be a credible approach. And that's the approach that we're taking very carefully, actually, at the BBC. So ultimately, what does it mean, nature positive? And why does this matter? It essentially means that we're going to give, as an organisation, more back to the planet than we have taken out of as an organisation, yeah? And that requires us to measure our impact on nature. And we've done that, actually. We've actually measured our biodiversity footprint. We lent into a team at Oxford to do this. And just to be, honest and open about this is a moving discipline, in effect. The sort of carbon and net zero world is still a little bit unsettled in some areas, particularly around the net of net zero and some of the standards that are being applied, and obviously the carbon market as well. But there's lots of scientific gaps that we're trying to fill here in the nature space and the biodiversity space. And the Arup report was quite critical for highlighting, that we weren't actually capturing the sort of below ground carbon sequestration, and we're taking that further in terms of root systems and the amount of biomass that we were missing, in effect, that was happening below ground. So nature positive BBC means that we need to be targeting by 2050 a position that we can comfortably and confidently say that we are doing more good for nature than bad, yeah. And then we measure our impact on nature, our biodiversity footprint. That's how we think about this as a business and as an organisation. We measure that as a biodiversity, and there's different techniques of doing that. We utilised a system called life cycle assessment, and we lent into a team of experts at Oxford to do that. There are different ways of doing it, but it's a credible TNFD, Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosures approach. And then we went around the organisation and we said, okay, what can we do about it? You know what I mean? Now it's coming into sight. We know the areas that are hotspots for us. How are we going to mitigate that impact? We ran workshops with different teams, content teams, production teams, but also operational teams. And then at the moment, we're actually looking at our natural assets. So we've got lots of sites. We've got 225 globally, actually. Where are there opportunities where we can directly get involved with our own BBC sites? And we've got 4 sites at the moment that we're looking at sort of uplift against those sites in terms of interventions that we can make that will actually increase the biodiversity on those particular sites. But we also know that in order to reach a credible nature neutral position and ultimately a nature positive position to getting above that line, we're going to have to make some investments in natural capital. And that's why these examples of these projects that Nattergal are developing are so key to us and that are of interest. If you go to the next slide, please. So, just to reiterate, why does this matter to the BBC? Well, we're known for our wildlife programming. We're actually world renowned for it. And there's a lot of association with a lovely man that lives in Richmond on the BBC brand, Sir David Attenborough and his programming. But it's not just on Natural History Unit programming that talk to this. We also have Springwatch Country File, and we have loads of news content on this topic as well. So we can't say that we don't understand that we've got a polycrisis here. We've got a climate problem. We've also got a problem with biodiversity loss as well. And as a public service broadcaster, our role is to, we have a responsibility to relay information and content that is in the public interest. And this is a topic that's definitely, and we check this all the time, by the way, we run surveys, and we know our audiences, and particularly our UK audiences, care about this topic, about nature. We're actually a nation of nature lovers, and 51% of the UK population don't know we have a problem, which is worrying. They think that we live in this green and pleasant land, and in fact, we've got a lot to do in this area, and we are bottom of the league, So this is a public interest and importance in terms of talking to this topic for the BBC. And we have a remit to inform and educate and inspire on it, which is why it matters. So we have to get this right. If you go on to the next slide, please, Alice. So what do organisations need to do? We have a role not just in terms of our content, as I've talked about, but we also have a role, I think, in, telling other organizations, bring particularly our supply chain, but also other sectors and other organizations with us on this, and being a lighthouse on the topic and being transparent on what we're doing as an organization on this. So there's sort of three things that if every organization or business got right, then we'd be in a much better place and we'd be, cracking on with solving the problem. So we're taking a position where we're very, very focused on deep decarbonisation. So we know we have to eliminate our emissions at source and permanently. And we don't, in our strategy, our net zero strategy, we don't have a heavy reliance on offsetting. Yeah, so we've got to do the hard work of actually transitioning the business away from fossil fuels and decarbonising at speed and at scale across the BBC. We know that this is a bigger problem than carbon. We're not myopic about it just being about carbon. We know that it's bigger than carbon. We've measured that. And you have to start, the starting place is to measure your biodiversity footprint. And there are ways to doing that. And we're very happy to share our methodology. It's also much more localized, this problem, in terms of biodiversity. So global emissions, net zero, climate change is a global problem. The localized impact that we have as an organization is showing us that it's actually sort of site level, country level, site level, in terms of where we are actually having an impact. And that's what you need to bring into site. And then the third point is, once you've measured it and you've mitigated it, you have to adopt a halt and restore nature strategy. And that requires us as an organization to mitigate as much as we can, but also to make investments, to set targets, and to make investments into nature in the future. So we are aligned to a 1.5 degree. We've adopted the science-based target system, and we're actually committed to, if you go on to the next slide, I think, we're committed to the science-based target system. We're at the moment going through an approval process for our long-term targets, which we hope will wrap up in the next couple of weeks, actually. And we'll be communicating that. So we've got near-term targets, long-term targets, science-based targets aligned and aligned to that net zero standard. We've also been looking at the science-based targets for nature targets. And we're focusing on land targets at the moment. And those three targets that you can see on the slide here: land footprint reduction, no conversion of natural ecosystems, and that's in our supply chain, our indirects, but also this investment in nature and investment in landscape engagement. So the way I'll finish here, because I do want to I think it's important that we have a conversation and Q&A, but the way we're thinking about this is that these two areas, net zero and nature, need to come together. And that's how you optimize this model as an organization. So you don't see them as separate pillars, if you like, or separate agendas, that you bring them together. And there's some very good examples of that. So we know if we reduce our property footprint, for example, and optimize our property portfolio to have less space, not only does that have a benefit for the energy that we use and the corresponding carbon emissions, but it also reduces our land footprint and our impact on biodiversity. Yeah, we also know that if we eliminate diesel from our production in our generators, we use a lot of diesel for our content production and our open broadcast teams. If we move away from eliminate that and move to sort of battery and hydrogen solutions, that we can have not only a corresponding benefit for carbon, reduce our carbon emissions by doing that, but we also have a benefit for air pollution and the extraction that happens as a result of creating that diesel on our behalf. So it does come together, and that's what we're bringing to site, the integration and codependence of these two agendas, if you like, and that we can optimize this model. And then the investments that we make, importantly, because that's what we're looking at the moment, what the gap is in terms of our impact, how much we can mitigate, and therefore how much we're going to have to make an investment into this, is that you can bring into site both the carbon and the biodiversity at the same time when you make these. And the Nattergal sites are case in point on this in terms of they're sequestering carbon, and the science is becoming quite clear on that now, but they're also generating biodiversity net gain. So I think I'll probably stop there, but very happy to field questions on how we're approaching this at the BBC.
Thanks, Danielle.
Great, thank you so much, Danielle. Ivan, do you want to explain this image quickly before I...
Oh yeah, this is one of my favorite images from the report, drawn by some very talented guys at an organization company called Dig & Co, landscape architects. It's that my favorite photo in the top left again, but also tries to show that carbon and biodiversity are completely linked. And that if we look after biodiversity and think about nature first, the sequestration will follow in 90% of cases. So it's as your carbon grows, so does your nature in this instance. And it also highlights how many roots are below ground and all that carbon below ground that just currently isn't being captured by so many verification schemes.
Great, thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can all see each other. But thank you all so much. That was very interesting. And we've had a few questions coming in that Ivan has helpfully been answering as they come through, which is great. I have a couple of questions just to kick us off with. So Danielle, one of the things that we've spoken a bit about is kind of bringing everyone along in this journey. And I think there is still a fair amount of uncertainty, and particularly when it comes to investment and kind of bridging that gap between where we are with the data and sort of needing to take that leap of faith. And it definitely feels like we've seen businesses and corporates very much focus on that climate lens. What can we as people working in this space do to really try and bring others along with us?
In terms of sort of businesses and bringing businesses along with us, is that the
yeah,
question?
I think it's just a sense that, you know, businesses are very climate focused, and it's really trying to bring in that nature angle.
Yes.
You know, how do we get the CFO to take a leap of faith that this is something worthwhile investing in?
Yeah, look, I'll answer it from a business perspective, and then I'll perhaps answer it, if it's okay, from an audience perspective as well, because all our audiences, you know, a lot of our audience members also work for businesses as well as, you know, being younger audiences that go to schools and live in our community. But from a business, I think the key thing is get started. So we actually piloted TNFD, which I know the acronyms are very annoying, and they annoy me too. That's the Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosure. We did that because we are required, actually, we're regulated to respond to something called TCFD, which is the climate version of it, yeah. And we knew that TNFD was coming. We thought, okay, well, let's just get ahead of it and get match fit. And also at that point, around, you know, there's some very real brand reputational risk for the BBC to not have a position on nature, given our wildlife programming, yeah. So we went early on TNFD, and that's a good way of getting engagement at the board level and the senior level to sort of say, look, and it does sometimes start as a risk conversation. And what we're trying to do at the moment is convert that into an opportunity conversation as well, to say this is absolutely critical to the BBC brand and our future, and matters to people wanting to work here, but also brings business to our commercial arm as well by having being credible and reputable in this space. Yeah. So, for example, BBC Studios won't be able to commission productions if we don't meet the regulation, we're not compliant, and you know, we actually fail to meet our targets, for example. We've got numbers against this, by the way, actual financial impact numbers about what this would be. So I think it is about it is a sort of new area. It's quite technical. You know, I've just hired somebody into my team that has I think he's got 11 years experience at Arup in nature and biodiversity. So to in-house the expertise as a head of nature is a really good idea for the bigger corporates. But I think even the smaller ones as well need to get themselves organised and ready for this, because it is coming. Yeah, we can't just focus on carbon and climate. The two are very much linked. In fact, I would argue that it's actually more about nature than it is about climate, because the reason why this has happened is because we're in a sort of planetary overshoot or an ecological overshoot situation, and that is what is causing climate change as well. But in terms, very quickly, in terms of our audiences as well, because the job of the BBC is to put this out in the public discourse. First thing is to debunk some of the myths that exist out there, and we're monitoring that through our audience surveys and our audience monitoring team, asking the questions of people to, you know, what do they understand about the term biodiversity, for example? What do they understand by the term nature positive? Do they know that the UK sits at the bottom, absolute bottom of the league, by the way, in the European, certainly in the European and OECD countries, in terms of you know, our biodiversity intactness. And as I said, there's some perception gaps there that we need to close, and that's our job as a public broadcaster, to inform people on the truth on this topic and where we actually are as our state of nature here in the UK. So we have to debunk get it clear what the facts are. We have to put this in the public discourse to bring everybody with us, and that includes business, but it also includes, all of our audiences. And we think about this in terms of schools, community, business, as well, and how we engage people. And then thirdly, what the solutions are. Yeah, bringing to life and bringing to people, TV screens, radio, making it clear to people what the solutions are, making them very practical, making the stories, telling the stories about this, hopeful stories, because there's some great work, very exciting work going on in this space. And we need to surface that. It's not a gloomy story. In fact, we find that people connect much better emotionally on nature than the depressing topic of climate and the future scenarios that are played out. It's a really good way of engaging people is through nature, because everybody cares about nature.
Yeah, it definitely feels a lot more tangible for the general public to understand than climate, which, who really knows what that looks like. Looking kind of ahead to the future, one thing that I wanted to pick up on, and we've just had a question come in, is around what a good market looks like in the future. And one thing that I noted from the report was that estimations for the growth of the carbon market are increasing 15-fold by 2030 and 100-fold by 2050. I guess my question, Amy or Ivan, is, do you feel like we're moving in the right direction to have enough supply to meet that demand?
You go, Amy.
Thanks, Ivan. It feels like we're moving in the right direction. I guess there's two bits to there. Do we have enough supply? Supply can increase, but that might not necessarily be the right thing. It's about, I guess, creating good projects and how that supply is brought to market. I think one of the biggest challenges, because I saw there was another question around policy and what you need in order to really unlock the investment into these types of projects. So I think one of the things that you need is that scale. So it's about creating sort of rigorous, high quality projects, and that needs the science behind it. And I think we're moving in that direction. But you also need a policy and investment environment that supports that. So there's lots of elements to the market that I think various groups are working on at the moment. That you need the standards. So in the UK, for example, we've got 2 government-backed codes, but we've highlighted there's a gap here in terms of what's the route to market for these rewilding projects. So there's a gap there in terms of the standards that you use. There's gaps in terms of the policy, as in there's not clear policy on how you sell the ecosystem services, the stacking and the bundling. And there's a gap as well in terms of how do you aggregate the projects to create really investable propositions. So like you said with Vera, Ivan, that you need to have a certain scale to make that cost effective to then attract that bigger investment into those projects. And I think there's something there around the government funding that's being used to kind of de-risk some of these projects, how it's being administered in lots of small chunks, in a way sort of holds back the market a bit, perhaps, because you get lots of smaller projects, whereas actually what you want to achieve is much more landscape or catchment or much bigger projects that take a more holistic view. So it's great that government's recognizing the challenge and putting money into it, but there's also probably a transition that's required in terms of how that public funding is used to then unlock the private funding to make sure it's not crowding out. And I'll probably hand over to Ivan, who'll probably give a better answer on that.
Well, no, I'll just add to that, and in defence of the current schemes at the moment, landscape recovery, which is in England again. Sorry, everyone who's from the rest of the UK here. Landscape recovery is an ambitious scheme led by the English government, trying to blend public finances to get landscape scale projects ready for private investment. And Boothby, the case study we had, is the kind of leading pilot on that at the moment, and we're just in negotiations with DEFRA about what that actually means and how we can make this work. So stay tuned for a few months' time, and we will be allowed to talk about that, and we can do another webinar. But it is happening. We are moving in that direction. And whilst Boothby is a single landowner, I saw another question about landscape scale collaboration. A project that I actually worked on with Arup as well a few years ago at NEP called Wheel to Waves, which is a 10,000-mile nature corridor with 1,000 different landowners in, alongside the other landscape recovery pilots. There are some really ambitious collaborative projects going ahead, and they will need aggregation of some kind to make the economics work. And so whilst we don't have all the answers, as you've seen today, and we're just trying to answer some of them, there is stuff happening, and it will work eventually if we just keep pushing at these barriers and find the kind of right prices and the right mechanisms for measuring and the right ways to verify and the ways to capture all of this carbon in the system, and then we're off, really.
Yeah, I think just trying to broaden it out a little bit, and touching on some of the questions around other stakeholders in this space. So Ivan, in terms of your engagement with farmers, local authorities, kind of had a few questions in around how farmers sort of respond to these types of projects. Are you able to give some examples to the types of farmers that you've been working with in Boothby and other sites, for example? Yeah,
absolutely, Alice. My internet's just gone dodgy, so stop me if I turn into a robot. But yeah, Boothby is one example of a kind of all-out land use change rewilding project, which can sit controversially with some people. Our approach on all of our sites, I'm sitting in one of them right now, which is really nice. Our approach on all of our sites is to start with community engagement. So we spend lots of time and build a team who are locally ingrained in the community to both communicate our plans, help change our plans depending on what the community feel, and one large group of that community are farmers. And so whilst not everyone always agrees with what we're doing and the way we're doing it, the financial mechanisms that we're going to hopefully pioneer and use to make change will be really applicable to the farm landscape as well, when it's lots of bits added together, as we were just talking about. So I think broadly, our neighbours are quite supportive. And if you look at Wheel to Waves down at NEP and the River Ada farm cluster, which I used to facilitate when I worked there, NEP was not always locally popular amongst the farming community, but in the last 5 years have made a real effort to communicate, and local farmers have really engaged and communicated back. So I think broadly, everyone's pretty happy within the same landscape as long as you're communicating with each other and doing your best to bring everyone along the journey, and there's as much give as there is take. Yeah, and I think that really touches on, we see quite a lot of skepticism in the media around offsetting rewilding. And Ivan, we've spoken before about how there's lots of terms flown around, sort of around high integrity and all that kind of thing. How do you, and you've sort of touched upon it in the community engagement, but how does Nattergal go about making sure that you are really doing the gold standard? Yeah, good question. I mean, I've touched on the community there, so we won't go too much more into community engagement, but apart from the fact that we spend, the first year of any new project talking, having cups of tea and doing village hall meetings and bringing people to the site and really trying to engage people and get them to volunteer and just join the local farm clusters. Every time we start a new site, we can find the local farm cluster, join it, try and just be as open and communicative as possible, both with our research, our financial models, or financial mechanisms rather, and also what we're planning to do and why we think it's important. We're not arguing to our local landowning community that they should all rewild. We do think that it's necessary, otherwise we wouldn't be doing it. And we do think that there needs to be more space for nature within the farm environment. So yeah, we drive that forward. But I guess the other driving principle of Nattergal is about biodiversity first. Every decision we make is about what's best for the ecosystem recovery and what's best for nature. And then going, okay, well, how many carbon credits does that mean? And how many BNG units does that mean? And rather than starting with how many carbon credits can we generate in this piece of land, or how many BNG units can we generate on this piece of land? Because if you start with that in mind, you're going to drift down a dangerous path towards doing the wrong thing for nature. And that's why it's a kind of crucial starting point, is we think through the ecosystem and the recovery, and then figure out the ecosystem services in the credit unit language afterwards. And then I guess the other couple of things. One is our team. Very proud of our team. Each site has a local team, and then working with scientific partners and academics. So, you know, and the work with Arup was all driven by partnerships with Carbon, Tree Economy, Queen Mary University. It's crucial that you work with other people to both kind of check your homework, but also pioneer new space in the science rather than assuming we know everything already. So collaboration ultimately is the other thing I would argue is so important.
Great, thank you so much. And just to say to everyone asking your questions, they're all brilliant. I don't think we're going to have time to go through them all today. What we'll do is make a note of them, and feel free to either drop me an email address. Everyone should have my email address already, but we'll make a note of them and try and get back to you all with them. I'm just conscious of time and sort of running over a little bit and giving everyone a little bit of their lunch break back. Just to wrap up and say thank you so much to all of our brilliant panelists for all your insights, and to all the audience. Your questions were amazing, and we could have gone on for hours talking about this, which shows that there's lots more to be done in this space, but lots of brilliant people working in it. So yeah, just say thank you very much for our panelists. I'm not sure if any of you want to say a final word before we jump off.
Just to say thanks very much. I've done my best to answer as many questions I could actually in the Q&A panel, but yeah, we're happy to respond to further questions, aren't we, Alice?
Yeah, and we'll share, just to a few people's questions, we'll share slides and the recording as well.
Yeah, and just reading through all these amazing questions, I'm sorry we haven't had time to go there. There's some really interesting ones. But yeah, I just appreciate everyone joining. And my hope when we started this was that we were coming up with solutions rather than having a presentation about all of the issues and barriers. So I really hope we've achieved that to a degree, and feel really excited. Very sad not to be at Groundswell today, but really excited at Climate Week and Groundswell this week and all of this amazing stuff going on. It feels like, you know, I volunteered at Groundswell in 2017 in its first year when it was just like a hippie festival on the side, and now it's this mainstream event. It feels like we're finally reaching the crescendo of change, and I guess that shows from all the interest today. And thanks to Danielle, Amy, and you, Alice, for coming on the webinar as well.
Yeah, and thanks for having me as well. It's been a great project, and although the funding ran out ages ago, we're still working together, so it's a sign of real success, and it's been great working on it. Not the end. Who knows what we'll be in 20 years' time if we look back at that 20 years ago. Great, thank you so much, everyone. Have a lovely day.